Again, I just want to welcome you warmly. This is our very first webinar for the 2022-23 year. And I'm so pleased to have such a well-known and articulate speaker with us today. And she's nodding her head. No, yeah, you are. I had a chance to read her work and take a look at some of her publications, and I think we're really going to be inspired and really know what kind of work we need to do. So we're looking at integrating green skills from a wide scope, green empowerment, green skills, and transformational skills into classrooms. And how do we do that? So of course, we're starting off with our welcome. I want to, of course, acknowledge the land that we're on, and then introduce our speaker, Dr. Christina Kwauk. And then at the end of our session, we'll have a little bit of Q&A, as well as tell you what's coming up. And there's both some in-person and some hybrid opportunities. So with our land acknowledgement, we've gotten into a tradition of introducing you to an Indigenous artist. And our artist today is Andy Everson, and he created this work in 2015. It is affiliated with the Orange Shirt Society. And recently I've been thinking about our land acknowledgements, and a text came across my desk in terms of, how to revise your land acknowledgement, how to make it meaningful. So I'm just going to add a few more things, and I'll read the land acknowledgement. So when we think about land acknowledgements, we understand that it's a statement of our commitment to the truth of our shared history. And we know that shared history is a painful history of generations of cultural genocide. And the acknowledgement that we give guides us into the future and provides us with an opportunity to build meaningful relationships with local Indigenous communities, and of course, take action. Our words need to be backed up by what we do. And so in rethinking your land acknowledgement, and my personal one, it asks you to consider your commitments to learning and decolonizing your spaces. Well, I'm really excited to say I'm embarking on my own learning journey with an opportunity that was given by the Outdoor Learning Store, where we're going to be learning for a full year of 4 seasons of reconciliation, with some First Nation elders and knowledge keepers from the West Coast. And that was an opportunity we also put in our TDSB Eco Schools newsletter. So if you're interested in doing the same, it's an adult personal reflection course that I encourage you to take a look at. So I'm committed to my own learning and decolonizing my own spaces. In terms of planning to support Indigenous communities, that's now the work of our department in how we can support knowledge building and knowledge sharing from the Indigenous perspective. And you'll see that some of our upcoming webinars and professional learning includes that. And of course, I want to recognize the Urban Indigenous Education Center, who helped craft the land acknowledgement we'll be reading today, but recognize that injustices like climate injustice, the number of trees on school properties, the number of traffic-related air particles often impact poor and marginalized communities in Toronto. And so these are some of the environmental injustices that continue. And so I just wanted to expand my own land acknowledgement in these ways. And so we acknowledge that we are hosted on the lands of the Mississaugas of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Wendat. We also recognize the enduring presence of all First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples. And just to let you know a little bit about our artist, I'm just going to scroll that. Andy Emerson is a dancer, artist, and grandson of the late Chief Andy Frank of the Comox First Nation in so-called BC. And he has also the honor of being seated, and I'm going to try and get this right, Kwakwaka'wakw First Nations. He sings traditional songs and creates and performs ceremonial dances at potlatches and a number of different dance groups. He actually has a master's degree in anthropology and explored notions of the contemporary identities of the Comox First Nation members, inspiring him to create a company called the Copper Canoe, which specializes in creation of Aboriginal language media. And so his artwork is part of that. And this artwork he has generously shared with anyone who would like to use it for educational purposes. However, again, we've seen this art being misappropriated for commercial purposes. So if you're purchasing and see a shirt or a flag with this symbol on it, just make sure it's coming from a legitimate nonprofit group like the Orange Shirt Society. All right, so thank you. Again, welcome. The entry poll should be still open if you're just coming in. So happy that you're joining us today. And I know we have some teacher candidates, we have some TDSB teachers, we have some community members, and we're just so pleased that you're here. So Dr. Christina Kwauk, again, a privilege to have us. She's coming in now, I learned, from the east side, east side of North America. And she's an education consultant. She's the research director at Unbounded Associates and the head of climate and education at the Education Commission. She is a social scientist and a policy analyst with expertise on girls' education, 21st century skills, and youth empowerment. And most important, the intersections we know that climate change has with gender education. So I'm really thrilled to see that. Christina, you've published numerous policy papers, including the New Green Learning Agenda, Approaches to Quality Education for Climate Empowerment. And you're also co-author of the book, What Works in Girls' Education, Evidence for the World's Best Investment. And lastly, you're the co-editor of Curriculum and Learning for Climate Action Towards a Sustainable Development Goal 4.7 Roadmap for Systems Change. So Christina, I'm going to stop talking finally and over to you.
Thank you so much, Pam, for that really lovely introduction. And I always learn so much. I think the United States has a far way to go when it comes to recognizing and acknowledging the lands in which we currently occupy. And it's always a great lesson to learn from our northern neighbors how much this has become part of who you are and the way that you introduce events like this. So I appreciate that. I'm coming from Piscataway and Anacostan lands here, now known as Washington, D.C. And it's something that I certainly am trying to integrate more into how I also introduce myself and where I come from or where I'm living at the moment. But it's a pleasure to be with you all today. As Pam mentioned, I come to this work from a very kind of circuitous route. I was not an environmental educator or even interested in the environment growing up. I am now, for sure, but I come to this work from the field of gender and education. So most of my work before was on girls' education and really trying to increase the evidence around why we needed to invest in gender equality in education in order to achieve our things like sustainable development goals or even our learning goals. But as I was doing that work, it became very apparent that the climate crisis was going to threaten to undo all progress that we were making in the field. And if we weren't going to pay attention to this, continued inequality and injustices would happen around the world. And so I began to look at climate change and its intersectionality with our sort of issues in the girls' education field. And since then have just really been focusing on how we can address simultaneously multi-solve for challenges in both gender equality in education as well as climate resilience in education. So I come to this work from a very different perspective. But again, see that some of the debates and the controversies around prioritization versus integration of the issues that we care about run very similar to the same controversies around prioritization and integration that we see in climate and education. Just as an example, when we speak about the importance of life skills or gender empowerment in the girls' education space, and then we hear other actors suggesting that we need to really focus on foundational literacies first, it's sort of a no-brainer to me to say, well, you can tackle foundational literacies while also tackling life skills and gender empowerment and so on. And the same goes with green skills and climate change. As you know, our growing global community of education actors and decision makers and stakeholders around the world begin to understand the importance of education for climate action, what we have seen less of is the movement from this gut feeling that we know we got to do something about it to actual implementation. And we've seen in the work that I do in the policy space as well as the research space, decision makers are really, slow to move on this. And part of the challenge, I think, is identifying pathways that align enough with existing priorities like foundational literacies, but that are also pathways that leave room to nurture the seeds for transformative change. And so in that context, that I think it's one of the biggest challenges we have to address is how we frame the issues that we care about. So in this case, green learning or gender empowerment, amidst a growing list of priorities. So in this presentation, I'll describe a little bit of how I've been working with my own company, Kwauk and Associates, as well as with my sister company, Unbounded Associates, to help work on this framing so that it becomes easier for decision makers to see and to communicate that solving for climate means also solving for education, and that solving education also means solving climate. So my talk today will be broken down into 3 parts. I'm going to start a timer for myself so I can make sure I don't go over 30 to 35 minutes. So the first part of the talk will overview 2 problems, and that's the climate crisis and the learning crisis, and how we can shift our thinking about these in ways that empower transformative change. And then the second part overviews a possible solution. And the solution that I will offer today is a framework for solving problems of education for climate action, or what I like to call a new green learning agenda. And then the third part will provide some examples of this in practice and look at 5 green design elements that have helped me to put some of this theory into practice. And as a forewarning here, I'll have some time for us to engage you all with some questions on menti.com. I'll be providing the codes when we get to those points, but just to let you know that, if you have a cell phone or if you have the website up or something, get ready for that for later. Okay, let me advance my slides here. Okay, so to start, so typically what I do in the spaces that I operate in is we work with decision makers to try to understand that how we frame the climate crisis matters, especially when it comes to defining our education and training solutions. So climate change is on the one hand a technical challenge. So due to human activity over the last century, the Earth's atmosphere now contains more greenhouse gases than it can naturally absorb, trapping heat and causing average temperatures around the world to rise. I think we all know this. With the problem focused on greenhouse gases, especially on carbon dioxide, the solution that follows is to decrease the amount of greenhouse gases in the Earth's atmosphere by removing existing emissions and mitigating against further emissions. And then one of the social adaptations needed is a transition from high carbon economies to low or carbon neutral economies, what many might call a path to a green economy. And so the implications there for the education sector is to build a workforce with the specific capacities to support such a transition. But climate change is also a sociological problem or an adaptive challenge, which requires not just technical skills for carbon capture technologies or for wind turbine technicians, but also new ways of being, thinking, and doing in the world. So on the one hand, we can frame this adaptive challenge as rooted in unsustainable behaviors at the individual level. So our consumption patterns, our energy usage, our lifestyle choices, but also at the systems level. So for example, we have resource intense, large scale agricultural, commercial farming, for example. At the individual level, the role of education then is to shift the individual's capacities, their generic capacities, towards those that generate more sustainable behaviors or innovations or ideas. And this might include improving the individual's awareness of climate change, as well as their knowledge of the solution. So like driving electric cars, recycling, or in this case of the photo here, vertical farming. But the adaptive challenge of climate change isn't just a problem of unsustainable behavior. It's also one of human systems. So to this effect, if we conceptualize the climate crisis as a symptom of unjust social and economic systems, including policies that perpetuate environmental racism or economies that incentivize extractive and polluting industries, then we begin to see that the role of education expands to developing the transformative capacities of individuals in society to catalyze broader systems change for both social and climate justice. So each of these conceptualizations is valid. The climate crisis is a technical as well as an adaptive challenge. It's both individual and systemic. And just as there are no single solutions to climate change, there's no single educational solution for climate action. But when leaders and decision makers devise their climate action strategies, they're primarily focused on one aspect of the climate crisis, which is greenhouse gases, and therefore one pathway of solutions, which is closing the emissions gap. So this means that they're focused on closing the gap between the projected levels of greenhouse gases under business as usual, and then the level of emissions that we need in order to achieve our 1.5 degree target. So that gap, right? So this is where you'll typically see policy discussions about decarbonization and the transition to renewable energies and green economies. But what you're unlikely to hear among policy discussions is the urgent need to close the education gap. Or we can describe this as the difference between our levels of climate knowledge, which might be down here, and green skills and climate consciousness under an education as usual scenario, and then the level that these need to be increased to in order to achieve our climate mitigation, adaptation, just transition, and sustainability goals. So here on the left are some calculations that I did of global survey data conducted by Plan International last year, highlighting the gaps in climate change education content that young people reported learning in schools. And so the smallest gap in content, this 10% up here, excuse me, was around learning the impacts of climate change. And then the biggest gaps, these red bars down here, were around teaching how to engage in climate activism, or topics like the gendered impacts of climate change, or even how to participate in climate policy discussions. And when it comes to education policy gaps, my analysis of countries' national climate strategies, which Pam mentioned a little earlier today, found that some of the biggest policy gaps are around strengthening education systems to deliver climate change education, as well as other indicators like pervasiveness. So these two big red bars at the bottom. And this is pervasiveness refers to whether countries are calling for climate change education to be taught across all subject areas and across all levels of education. So from pre-primary through tertiary, and also technical and vocational education and training. So I point out these education gaps, not to say that we should not concern ourselves with the emissions gap. And quite the contrary, in order to close the emissions gap, we need to close the education gap, because closing the education gap means we're ensuring everyone has the knowledge about climate change and its solutions. Everyone has the green skills and the attitudes needed to engage in climate-friendly behaviors and to adopt low-carbon lifestyles and renewable technologies. It also means that everyone has the mindsets and the awareness of how individual and collective action can help bring down greenhouse gas emissions. So if we go back to, what's our problem with the climate crisis, if closing the education gap is the problem, then we need to begin to think about approaches that can help address this adaptive challenge with more adaptive solutions. Thinking about the skills that are needed that can help transform the way humans think and behave and act in this world, that doesn't necessarily always get us trapped in techno fixes that avoid tackling underlying root drivers. But a second problem, when we think about closing the education gap, is that we have to consider what kind of education we're talking about. We are the most educated in human history, yet also the most destructive to not only the planet, but also to ourselves. So another aspect of the problem we have to interrogate is how we frame the learning crisis and the education solutions that follow. And so here I like to use Stephen Sterling's original framework for considering education change. So to approach the task of education transformation from the lens of doing things better, is that sort of the way we approach things, this first row here? Because in this way, we risk engaging in conformative change that functions to maintain the status quo and to sustain the systems and structures that have led to our present condition. So this change is about achieving greater efficiencies and greater effectiveness in our existing system. So in essence, solving problems in education, regardless of whether that system is the right one, right? So this is we even see this today with some of our efforts to green campuses or green education. It oftentimes comes through as conformative change, perpetuating the status quo, because really it's just solving sustainability problems in education and not problems, as we'll see later, of education. So to follow on with that, we have to also make sure that we don't limit our discussions to doing better things. And in this case, these are reformative changes that merely grant equal access and opportunity to previously disenfranchised populations into the existing system. So, in our COVID world, this has been kind of where discussions have been. We recognize the gross inequalities in our education system, and because of COVID school closures, education systems went really quick to try to address things like the digital gap or unequal access to technology to enable more disadvantaged students to be able to participate in online learning, for example. So these are more reformative changes attempting to still solve problems in the education system, but create more equal access to those who have been disenfranchised from it. So instead, what I want to encourage us to think about is to really frame the urgency of the climate crisis and also the increasingly short window of time we have to take action to really begin to see and do things differently. So here, this means confronting long-time problems of education, not just in education, but problems of education, and to commit to the difficult transformative change that can significantly alter not only the system itself, but its underlying purposes and its values. And by seeing things differently, stakeholders can see that education as we know it, which is the legacy of the Industrial Revolution, is part of the problem perpetuating social norms and social structures that are harmful to both people and planet. So the solution here then is to disrupt the status quo and to reorient the purpose of education systems towards climate action, which requires the simultaneous achievement of gender and racial equality, as well as intergenerational and climate justice. So I want to take a moment to kind of check in with you all to get a sense of what you're thinking and ask you to go to menti.com. There are 2 questions. So I believe the first QR code here will take you to the first question. And respond to these questions. How do you typically talk about the climate crisis in your classroom? And the second question is, what are the problems in and of education that you might be grappling with in your teaching? Yeah, a lot of information, really overwhelming. Resistance to experiential learning opportunities. Yeah, I think this will be, when we get into the design elements later, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well, because some of the design elements are really grounded in experiential learning. And I know that oftentimes can create quite a bit of resistance. Difficulty applying transformative approaches, resistance from parents. Yes, eco-anxiety, absolutely. I'm actually facilitating a discussion tomorrow on eco-anxiety, and that is already giving me anxiety. Educators are not educated in these issues, therefore they cannot pass their knowledge. Yes, and I think that goes into some of that systemic issues around teacher training. Yeah, making students feel more optimistic, lack of appropriate teaching environments, especially outside classrooms. Yes, I think I get, I have some hope with some of these outdoor learning movements, but it's nearly not as systemic as we would hope. Okay, I think I'm going to keep going forward if that's okay with you all. Thank you so much for participating in that. And we'll have a couple more questions to come in a bit. So now I want to move in a little bit into this proposed potential solution. And that is this concept of a new green learning agenda. So to help decision makers grapple with this question of, what kind of education do we want? my colleague Olivia Casey and I set out to develop a framework that could help us focus the attention of decision makers, education leaders on a more holistic approach to education for climate action and climate justice. And we started to do this by scouring the literature to understand what kinds of skills matter in the context of climate change mitigation and adaptation and transformation. And we found that a lot of people are talking about green skills, but they're also talking about green skills in very different ways. So we wondered if we could synthesize these understandings into a framework to help decision makers design more transformative programs that not only build green skills in individuals, but also transform society. So I'll introduce you to this framework now, and we'll go a little bit deeper into this as the presentation continues. But this framework, or a new green learning agenda, was intended to help decision makers conceptualize a breadth of green skills needed to address the climate crisis, with the intention, again, of not just achieving climate action, but also climate justice. So it starts from a position that we frame the problem underlying the climate crisis, and how the way we frame that problem shapes our educational pathways, right? So whether we conceive of this of the problem as a technical challenge or as an adaptive challenge, whether we conceive of the source of the problem as an issue of greenhouse gases, as unsustainable individual behaviors, or as a symptom of unjust social and economic systems. It also takes into account whether the vision of the solution is a just transition to a green economy, the development of more sustainable behaviors, or to the transformation of more equitable systems. And then it also allows decision makers to deliberately consider a continuum of green skills that are needed to fuel a green economy as well as climate justice. And so here, I want to take a moment to spend a little more time laying out this breadth of green skills idea. So this encompasses specific, generic, and transformative capacities that are required to increase our collective resilience and adaptive capacity. And so, as I mentioned, Olivia and I consulted the literature to understand what kinds of skills matter in the context of climate change mitigation, adaptation, and transformation. And if I can get my slide to advance, there we go. And what we arrived at was this green skills continuum. So that is, we found that the way people talked about green skills generally coalesced around two particular but overlapping paradigms. So on the left side are skills that fell under a green job paradigm, or the specific capacities needed to thrive in green jobs in a low carbon green economy. And this list is not exhaustive. This is just indicative of the kinds of skills we found. And so these included skills like environmental management or project management, STEM skills, so your science, technology, engineering, and math skills, ICT skills, information, communication, and technology, skills that might fall under the rubric of very hard skills or very technical skills, right? And then in contrast was another group that discussed green skills in a very different way. So on the right side are skills for green transformation, or the transformative capacities needed to disrupt and transform both the individual and structural factors that exacerbate the climate crisis. So skills like integrative thinking, systems thinking, the ability to analyze and navigate unequal systems of power, collective action, and political agency. And then shared between these two paradigms of green skills in the middle column, what we are calling green life skills, or the generic capacities that build quote unquote greener ways of thinking, being, and doing, or skills that some of you might refer to as soft skills or socio-emotional skills, skills like critical thinking, problem solving, communication, empathy, personal leadership, open-mindedness, and so on. And so if we look across this continuum, we can build the technical skills needed to fuel transitions to renewable energy and a green economy. We can gain the green lenses through which we can view and see the world. And we can build a planetary consciousness that's needed to create new social systems that are in balance with our natural systems. And so, when we think about, different educational levels, different educational institutional types, we can begin to see how institutions and grade levels might concentrate on some or be better placed to explore some than others. But the idea here is to really begin to frame these as holistic skills and really begin to tackle them together through all of our educational institutional types and through all of our levels of education by really thinking about progressions of these skills. So while you might not be, promoting environmental ecosystem management in, kindergarten, there are foundational skills within that can lead to those more advanced environmental ecosystem management skills later in life, right? So the idea here is really to get education decision makers and educators to begin, moving from framing the climate crisis solely as a technical challenge that needs a technical fix, but to also think about it as the adaptive challenge that it is, that really requires new ways of thinking, being, and doing. And really seeing that, again, we need to frame the educational solution as building all three types of green skills, this breadth of green skills for everyone. It's not just low-skilled workers who will require some versus high-skilled workers requiring others, but really thinking, again, how can we begin to form some of these foundational breadth of skills for everyone? Okay, and so now I'll go a little bit deeper just to explain kind of the thinking behind this framework and sort of what the theory of change is behind each of these. So again, this first approach is really focused on developing specific capacities, so skills for green jobs that are needed to support that transition to a green economy. And so it also recognizes that these specific capacities also tend to be highly gendered skills as well, or skills that we perpetuate gender stereotypes around. And so it really recognizes that we need to seek to address these persisting gender gaps in green skills, especially the STEM skills that stifle women, especially women, girls and women's paths and other marginalized groups into green jobs. So again, thinking also of historically marginalized communities that might also be kind of tracked out of exploring and developing specific skills in STEM and so on. So approach one really centers a gender transformative approach to a sort of more technical education. But again, this technical education can be integrated throughout our different levels of education. And it also really urges us to expand our conceptualization of green skills even beyond STEM skills, to also include empowerment skills like the ability to read and decode and act upon one's social environment in very empowering ways. So in this way, marginalized groups like girls and women who are excluded from the present fossil fuel economy will not continue to be at the fringes of a green economy. So again, sort of our theory of change here. And then with the second approach, again, we shift from thinking about this technical training to more of our general education and our general learning. And it's really focused, again, on sort of these generic capacities or green life skills that can really translate into long-standing pro-environmental behaviors. So it conceptualizes green skills as being almost like a pair of green glasses that you can wear, helping individuals to make greener decisions and to engage in greener behaviors in a wide variety of contexts. And in this case, when we think about it from sort of an intersectional feminist lens, again, it argues that if girls' experiences or the experiences of any marginalized groups are added to the shade of our lenses, then we can result in behaviors that are much more empowering and that take into consideration their experiences in the world. And so here, again, thinking about this theory of change, this particular approach, the second approach, really centers a critical feminist, intersectional, and justice-oriented agenda in our more general approaches to education for climate action. And again, the underlying idea here is that if we know that like climate change education, for example, can lead to up to 20 gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions averted in a person's lipetime, then imagine if that climate change education were a general education that includes green skills, and 100% of our students were able to achieve that. What could be the potential impact on sustainable behaviors in the world? And then our third approach, the final approach, is probably the most radical of the three in terms of its focus on addressing the problems of education. And again, sort of how, approach 2 was focused on building green lenses through which we see the world. Approach 3 really focuses on building a feminist planetary consciousness. So really the way, our sense of awareness that our social challenges are intricately tied to our planetary challenges. So as an example, understanding things like gender inequality being intricately tied to the climate crisis, or things like violence against Indigenous people as being tied to the destruction of Indigenous lands. So we really want in this approach to really begin to integrate our awareness and our understanding of these sort of simultaneous crises. Again, and here the theory of change focuses on developing a more transformative approach to learning by centering the transformation of mindsets and confronting the underlying structures of inequality and systems of oppression that sustain climate vulnerability. So it positions green skills like disruptive thinking and political agency as a core piece of a larger framework of change that includes attention to our social and economic and political structures. And it argues that, through the development of girls and boys, feminist planetary consciousness, as well as the active disruption of social inequalities, like gender inequality and racial inequality, then we can see education seeding the social transformation that's needed to achieve the 1.5 degree target. So kind of to sum up this portion of the presentation, as a heuristic, this new green learning agenda framework, again, is intended to help decision makers and educators gauge where they are on an incremental journey towards a more holistic approach to education that is oriented towards enabling climate action and achieving climate justice. And again, just to be clear, we're suggesting that there are entry points, but that in all, we want all 3 approaches simultaneously. And for a moment now, I want to just, again, take a moment to just kind of get a sense of kind of where you see yourself in terms of an entry point into a new green learning agenda in your teaching. So for this question, the code is 64038545, and it's the first question of 2 in that code. So if you would just answer that first one, that would be great. And then we can move forward. There we go.
And again, as always, if you're not sure and you can't get to the Menti, feel free to share it either in the chat or out loud. Again, do you find that you want to work on a specific skill like coding, or do you want to work on a green life skill like empathy, or do you want to work on something like political advocacy or valuing Indigenous knowledges? And so these are all sort of the entry points, and all of them are good.
Absolutely. Yes. And I know that our attendees today sort of span the gamut in terms of age or grade levels. And so it's interesting to see that approach 3 is so far our sort of leading entry point here. Because typically these are the harder skills to get at, right? As some of our answers in the previous Menti sort of suggested, these more experiential and system changing kind of skills. Okay, great. So feel free to keep adding your thoughts there. I'm going to just, given time, just jump into some of our examples, because I'd love to talk a little bit about these design elements and then leave some time for questions if possible. So moving on to some examples to help decision makers grapple with this question of, again, thinking through how do we address the problems of education. We both at Unbounded Associates, mostly at Unbounded Associates, we've been working with different organizations to try to integrate this approach to problems of education and thinking about new green learning agenda through the work that they do. So just to give you a quick overview of this, we have one example focused on centering youth in the green workforce development, another on youth leadership and climate policy, and then a third example, which I'll dive a little bit deeper into, is on integrating climate justice into the K-12 curriculum. And so with our first example, so I think many of you, or I think at least a few of you are working at the more senior level grade levels of education, where perhaps the linkages to the green economy and green workforce might be more present in the minds of your students. But I think that there's also a lot of these recommendations that came through this particular work was really around exposing young people much earlier on to what the green economy is and what kinds of occupations and livelihoods there are at the present, and what possible new occupations there might be that we can't even yet imagine because of the way the climate crisis is shaping our economies. And so this particular collaboration was between Unbounded Associates, my sister company, and Chemonics International. And we worked, our target audience in this case was working with workforce development organizations and their decision makers around kind of incorporating young people and incorporating green skills into what typically had been before that just really like a livelihoods and youth workforce program. But instead, what we were trying to do through our new green learning agenda approach was to begin to shift stakeholders' perceptions that workforce development was all about technical skills, to really thinking again about that breadth of skills that young people were really in tune in terms of what they felt like they needed, but because the workforce development programs had typically entered it from a very technical perspective, we're not really attending to. And so we interviewed a whole bunch of youth ecopreneurs from around the world to hear their perspectives of the skills that they felt were most important to building their enterprises. And really using their insights to illustrate that there is space in the development of technical skills to really get at things that are much more transferable when we think about a focus on justice, a focus on equity, diversity, inclusion, and so on. And really thinking about things like the ability to run a workshop or to run a, to work in a team, to engage stakeholders, to initiate strategic planning, to build collective action. These all were important skills, but from their part, but that weren't like, how do you farm more sustainably, or how do you, reduce reliance on timber and switch to more renewable sources? Like, these were skills that, we can begin to build way early on in our early years around teamwork and around a self-initiative, around, thinking about others' perspectives when trying to convince them of something, right? So really, again, just thinking about it from a technical perspective and how do we expand that breadth. In the second example, we worked with Plan International, and we're targeting education programmers and decision makers that focus on adolescent youth in more non-formal spaces, although some also in formal environments. And here we were really trying to shift from this notion that change happens at the individual level in terms of individual behavioral change, to really expanding that to thinking about the transformative collective action that is so needed to instigate and catalyze systems change. So in this particular respect, this particular project, we focused on taking what had typically been a very individual-centered approach and began to build in exercises and activities that were very much focused on more of a civic orientation, but really broadened some of the action areas beyond what can I do as an individual to what can we do as a community, and how might we then put those plans into action. And so finally, this last example is really the heart of kind of where I think many of you might be sitting today in terms of really thinking about integrating climate justice or climate change or environmental issues into your teaching by integrating green design principles into the way you're teaching or into your lessons or so on. So this is an example of some work that we did with EcoRise, which targeted K-12 educators. And our main sort of targeted paradigm shift in this case was really building on what was an existing technical approach to environmental literacy and sustainability knowledge, and building, and also quite a lot of focus on socio-emotional skills as well, to really, again, expand that to thinking about transformative green skills. And the way that we did this, which I think perhaps might be where you all might find this interesting, was we used this in the context of auditing an existing curriculum, but I think you could use this by auditing your own practices and your own lesson plans or approaches to teaching, and really began to think about what are the key themes, the thematic areas, the light gray. We wanted to talk about environmental justice. We wanted to talk about climate resilience and so on, and just kind of getting a sense of how these concepts were spread across different units, across different modules, and seeing where the gaps were. But then importantly, and where we'll focus on now, was thinking about the different green design elements for how to actually convey sort of the learning through mostly experiential, but also through a lot of group work. So here, in terms of the 5 green design elements, this was a set of elements that Olivia and I, again, through our review of the literature, best practices in climate change education and environmental education, synthesized these different components. So I'll go through them in sort of the logical order, but again, I think that there's much more other kinds of ways to address this, is thinking about first the cognitive point of entry. So developing students' contextualization of the environment or climate crisis with a recent or relevant event that students can relate to through using something like a news article or video. The second one being the affective dimension. So ensuring that students have the opportunity to develop the empathy towards the problem or the issue. And this might be through a story that highlights the impacts of that environmental issue or climate change issue on people's lives. The third one being the existential component, where we challenge students' ways of living and being, their values, their beliefs, and their worldviews by encouraging them to enter into another's point of view through things like role play, where students take on different perspectives and really begin to question their own assumptions and ways of approaching an issue in their environment. And then the fourth component being an ownership component, building students' personal connections and their commitment to the issue by creating an action plan with fellow members of their classroom that could be used for their school, as an example, to reduce waste in this context. And then finally, the opportunities for action, and really here fostering a sense of agency and confidence in making more informed choices through activities like actually implementing an action plan that they put together. And so together here, we begin to think of these design elements to help us implement more effective green learning opportunities, because research tells us that it's not just, rote memorization or being told what to do that leads to behavioral change. The same thing happens with pro-environmental behaviors and mindsets. And so through the integration of these different components, we can get to some of what research suggests is best practices, where we root scientific processes in issues that have social implications and impacts, and really from there kind of develop the motivations and the recognition of how actions can be formulated and take place. I realize I just sped through that because I also just realized it's 4:55. My timer didn't go off. I just apologize. So I'm going to stop there. Maybe just even ask you. There was one more mentee question. Which of these design elements you feel like would be hardest to implement or easiest to implement? But I'll stop there because I just realized it's 5 till. I'm sorry. Maybe I'll turn it back to Pam. Yeah.
Well, I'm so glad that Tian has been putting the resources in the chat. And again, we'll be sending these out to all of you who are participating, because I actually want to now dive in and kind of go, okay, what does this mean for me? And so you've really given us a great overview, as well as some very concrete examples. So I am starting to envision what this means. And some of my big takeaways are that, when we think about our paradigms of how we understand the climate crisis, that's where we need to start, in terms of it. Is it just a CO2 issue, or is this going to be truly a just transition? And how do we make that happen? And how do we integrate things like gender and racial issues? Because climate change is impacting even just Pakistan right now. There's a country that emits one of the lowest amounts of greenhouse gases, and they're being impacted in ways that the lives are being lost, their future lives are being lost. And so we can't just say this is only about drawdown. This is about social change. But I have so many things to think about now, but I want to make sure you're right. What kind of questions do you have for Christina while we have her? So put them in the chat. I do see that we've got a few thoughts in terms of, how do we get this into high schools with our career counselors? How do we make sure that the green skills and green transformation is part of that? And I know civics has been redesigned, so maybe there's hope. But what questions might you have for Christina? And Christina, I'm going to also just pull up the following slides while people have a chance to maybe ask out loud or put their questions in.
Not so much a question, but I will say, Christine, I'm so pleased to see the affective domain recognized clearly because, when environmental ed sort of found its footings in the 1970s, the focus was heavily on the cognitive domain and on the existential crisis. We should be scared of this. It was very much a doom and gloom approach. And there wasn't much of an understanding, I don't think, at that point, that affect was really important as a part of the learning. So as an art educator, thank you for recognizing that. I love now that I've got a report I can draw on to convince others of the power of bringing all of these different dimensions together in our classrooms to introduce this learning to our students.
Thanks, Hillary, for adding that. And of course, we know that the head, heart, and hands analogy from David Orr is so important, and really you connect that. And so when we're thinking about what we do with the students, connecting them through their heart has more opportunity for it to stick. And so, yeah, I think it sort of comes into that. Right. Again, while you're thinking of questions, we'll just follow up with some upcoming events. So you'll see them on the screen there. I've got them on the other screen, so I'm just going to turn my head. I'm really excited that we get some in-person land-based learning in the city with, again, honoring traditions and Indigenous ways of knowing and being. And then we've got our conference as well in November. So connecting with communities, knowing that after COVID, connecting and reconnecting and rebuilding our communities is such an important part. And I think it goes into the green skills as well. Again, how do we work as a team? How do we be, how do we work together? How do we advocate for in social situations? So I'm excited about that, educating for climate justice in school communities. So again, that's hybrid. You can join us in person or virtual. First Stories in the City, John Johnson, I've attended one of his sessions walking through and also opening your eyes to the Indigenous presence in the city and understanding how it connects with how we live now. Again, you can follow us, TDSB Eco Schools. I think that URL might have changed. It might be environment, then Eco Schools. Chris, is that? I'm looking to you.
Yes, environment would be right
First.
after TDSB1.ca.
But if you're in TDSB, you can find us through the quick links on TDSB web by going to Environment Eco School. And of course, Boise's new website on Sustainability Climate Action Network is listed there. I'm going to put up a poll just to make sure that we're meeting your needs. Let me just find that poll. Entry poll and feedback poll. There we go. So if you have to run, it is 5 o'clock. Please just take a moment to put your thoughts in. But again, if you've got a question for Christina or a thought or comment, again, use the chat or just unmute yourself.
I see that Anne had a question about meeting with elected officials on curriculum change or education policy change. I think maybe if I could speak to just my limited experience in this area, in most cases, what I've seen, elected decision makers, politicians, appointed leaders as well, always show great interest in addressing the integration of climate change into the education curriculum and education system. But then when it actually comes to following up with that, really falling short. And I think part of the challenge is the level of bureaucracy and the level of the extent of the processes that have to take place in order to get things to change officially from the top down. And so in many cases, a lot of the sort of the communities that I've been in have begun to focus on not just sort of your national level decision makers, but really now focusing on the subnational and the district level. I think maybe, I'm not sure what's sub-province for you all, but a little bit more local, but not quite your school, but a little bit more kind of at the meso level where the global meets the local, primarily because actions oftentimes, especially in federal systems, get decentralized, where you have, your curriculum mandates at the big top, and then the actual decisions and the actions getting executed a little bit lower down. And that oftentimes also is where, when you talk to elected officials at the federal level, they're like, our hands are tied. We can't, that's not our place to do it. It's actually the local decision makers that have to implement. So we've begun to shift tactics and really, try to advocate at the national level for high level policy change and curriculum mandates, but work with more district level elected officials to really get more of the decision making and the changes that can happen in schools. So I think that's been a lesson learned for many of us. And I think also what the research even suggests as kind of the sweet spots for action is really that subnational level. So I don't know if that's helpful. And I think on the note of the guidance counselors piece, I don't know if this is the same in Canada, but oftentimes the guidance counselors are, at least in some of our schools, especially the lower years, also address socio-emotional development as well as beyond career guidance and so on. And what I'm seeing as a potential entry point is really beginning to integrate eco-anxiety and climate anxiety into the repertoire of social-emotional issues and mental health issues that counselors in our schools need to address in much larger frequency than before, and that might be the entry point for really beginning to address this in a way that I think we haven't thought about in the past. So it's another aspect.
Well, great, thank you. And Anne is one of our co-chairs on our environmental sustainability community action committee, or advocacy or action. Can't remember what the A is for now, but yeah. So happy to have her here. And so thank you again. I just want to wrap it up. It looks like our feedback poll, yes, our learning needs were exceeded. Lovely to see that. And of course, most of us felt that our learning needs were met and or exceeded. So yes, and thank you again for all the resources that you brought our attention to, because I will be sharing those links with those that participated today. Again, great thanks to everyone who joined us today. And I know some of you had to go. And so if you haven't already, enjoy the rest of your day. Truth and Reconciliation Day tomorrow. Remember to wear your orange shirts. And we'll be celebrating that. Well, if you probably celebrated this week as well. All right. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. Bye.